Forthcoming. I'm Shannon Miller. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and the Arts here at San Jose State University. And these are a series of talks which have been sponsored by the Knight Foundation. And I'm going to say a little bit about this particular series. But the idea behind this is to bring topics of interest to both our campus community and our community members. And I think that this talk is nicely representing that double-sided interest. So I want to thank you for attending our second Deep Humanities event this fall. Our series on Deep Humanities grows out of our conviction in the College of Humanities and the Arts that the humanities and arts have a powerful and increasingly important role to play in the world of technology. We are leveraging the arts and humanities to ask the most important questions of our time through our Deep Humanities lectures in concert with our Frankenstein series that ran this fall. Our Frankenstein series was celebrating or exploring the theme of Mary Shelley's 200-year-old novel that's celebrating its anniversary this year. And we, in the course of September and October, produced a number of events where disciplines throughout the arts and humanities engaged with this novel and its important ideas. Our premise within Deep Humanities, which has been running alongside of our humanities or our Frankenstein initiative, is that these fields provide a critical framework to evaluate our decision-making practices and ideally help us make better, more inclusive, and more ethical decisions around increasingly complex technologies that do not just fill our lives, they more and more frame our lives. We are also working to engage these important questions about the Silicon Valley at a moment of rupture, as issues of privacy, security, and its relationship to our politics are in the news almost every day. Within this series of Deep Humanities, we have had Martin Ford talk about the economic implications of robots in our workforce. Cordelia Fine discussed the theme of gender in the Silicon Valley. And on November 26th, in the same place at 7 p.m., Tobias Reese will be asking important questions about the human after the human here in Hammer 4. Today, I am delighted to introduce Margaret O'Mara, who's coming to talk to us about Silicon politics. She is the Howard and Frances Keller Professor of History at the University of Washington. She writes and teaches about the growth of the high-tech economy, the history of US politics, and the connections between the two. She is the author of Cities of Knowledge, published by Princeton in 2005, which explored the conditions for the creation of areas such as the Silicon Valley at the intersection of higher education and the Cold War defense industry. Pivotal Tuesdays, published by Penn Press in 2015, timely enough, explores 4 presidential elections of the last 100 years. And her next book, I'm assuming she's drawing on this for her talk today, will be coming out from Penguin Press, July 2019. It offers a history of the Silicon Valley, and it is entitled The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. Professor O'Mara is going to speak with us. We'll have an opportunity for conversation afterwards, and we have a book table downstairs where you can purchase her books as well as get her to sign them. So with no more ado, welcome to Professor O'Mara.
Thank you so much, Dean Miller, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really great to be here back in San Jose. The sun is shining. Yes, it's already started to drizzle in Seattle, but it's only a 2-hour plane flight away, so it's really great to be down here. And it's really great to be part of this Deep Humanities series. I'm a professor of history. I teach and write about American politics and about American business and about the tech industry. But I really am a humanist in that I am really interested in how culture and society is shaping and shaped by technology and technology industries. I'm interested in the intersection between politics and business and why that intersection happens and the role of individuals and groups and how the story of this place, Silicon Valley, intersects with broader currents in American history. So often Silicon Valley is understood and explained as kind of a special place, a place apart. But what I want to talk to you about today is how its history is intertwined in the history of modern America, how we cannot extricate it from that history, and that is why this history-making industry has such an imperative, so it's so imperative for that industry to reckon with its own history and to think about how it can truly change the world. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. These were the first words that Steve Jobs spoke as he introduced the iPhone. This is the shot you see here in 2007. The very first iPhone, only 11 years ago. It seems amazing. Something that has become so much a fabric, the smartphone's a sort of thing, a way that we run our lives. He goes through, this is sort of the classic Steve Jobs demo, the type of product demo and product announcement that he made famous throughout his career at Apple. And Steve Jobs, of course, in talking about the revolutionary nature of the products, was an important crafter of a way of thinking about and talking about Silicon Valley and the technologies it made. He was not only a technologist, he was a master storyteller. He was extremely good at explaining these really complicated technologies in ways that made it understandable to ordinary people and made people understand, oh, this is how it can change my life. This is how I can use a computer. And the mythos around Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, the founders of this company, in their garage in Los Altos, and the way that they kind of came out of nowhere to build this iconic Silicon Valley brand is very much a kind of foundation, one of those foundational stories of Silicon Valley. And it's a story that's a very familiar one that's told again and again, these scrappy young entrepreneurs in a garage with dreams of, sort of pushing technological boundaries and building these marvelous machines and taking them to market. And this is the triumph of free market capitalism. This is the triumph of innovation. This is something that is a new economy, a new way of doing things, of breaking the old rules. But that story leaves out a longer connection that the Valley and the people of the Valley, the iconic people of the Valley and all of the other many thousands of people who made the place work, as the people in this room probably understand better than a lot of people outside of the Valley. That leaves out this longer story and also leaves out a political narrative that has shaped the Valley's history. But the story that Steve Jobs and others told about the place that they were from and the industry they were creating was something that was a story that gained velocity in part because politicians also picked up on that story, picked up on the great promise, the amazing promise of technology, what it might bring, and particularly bring to an America that in the 1980s and after was trying to figure out its next act. An America that was deindustrializing, where the political landscape was changing, where the old rules of how the economy should work no longer seemed to apply, and where politicians of both parties were trying to figure out what the next act was and saw high tech, and particularly Silicon Valley tech, as something of a golden ticket, as this might be the answer. This is the sunrise as the rest of American industry sunsets. Here is where the future lies. So here's another moment, a product demo, so to speak. Moment one, this is Ronald Reagan at the end of his presidency in May of 1988. I love the visual juxtaposition between Jobs and the iPhone and Reagan and Stalin. Oh, sorry, Lenin. Reagan's advance team did not want this visual to happen, but they couldn't get the Soviets to put a curtain over Lenin's statue. So here he is on his first trip to the Soviet Union, the first time an American president had visited the USSR in 14 years. And it's this momentous occasion. This, of course, is in the era of glasnost and perestroika and Gorbachev and this reconciliation. And the man who had declared that the Soviets were an evil empire only a few years before was now coming to Moscow. And he gives this speech during his visit at Moscow State University, which was and is the premier technical university in Moscow, to 600 students, computer science and engineering students, in the audience. Maybe some of them subsequently migrated to the United States and are here in Silicon Valley building technology companies and heard Reagan long ago, 30 years ago, speak to them. And so he has this opportunity to speak to this captive audience about what America is about, the promise of, what does American democracy bring you? What does it, what kind of revolution does America promise as an alternative to a now crumbling Soviet Union and a crumbling Soviet economy? And he doesn't talk about Morning in America. He doesn't talk about the Founding Fathers or George Washington or usual American iconography. He talks about the microchip. He says there's a revolution brewing across the world, and its catalyst is this tiny device, smaller than your fingernail, that is changing everything, will change the way we're communicating. And I'll say the people who are creating this are just young people like you in their garages with a dream. He's repeating back to this foreign audience this story, this entrepreneurial story of Silicon Valley, one that does have its roots in the truth of Hewlett and Packard in their garage and Jobs and Woz in their garage and other guys in their garages. But it also misses one important part of the story. Second moment, fast forward 1996. Here we are 8 years after Reagan's speech, and we have a new party in power, a new president, a new generation in power, Bill Clinton and Al Gore. Al Gore, of course, the commander in geek, the chief, the Veep who loved technology before most Washington politicians could tell a mainframe from a mini computer. He was an early adopter and an enthusiast and deeply interested in technology. No, he did not invent the internet, nor did he claim to have invented it, but he was early on very deeply engaged and interested in computer science, computer hardware and software, and what the government might do to encourage research and development in that area. And this is halfway through, this is ramping up to the re-election campaign of Clinton for a second term, and they're coming to Concord, California for maybe some people in this room remember this, Net Day, this big day in which all these schools in California were all going to be wired to the internet. And this was, again, a manifestation of this idea that had really blossomed during the Clinton years, in part because the sort of a genuine interest on the part of both Clinton and Gore in the Valley and what it did, and these strong allies that the administration found in the Valley, advisors and people who were entrepreneurs and business leaders here who came to the White House and advised them on telecommunications and technology policy as the internet was first commercializing. And Net Day was kind of the kickoff of this new push towards computers in schools and internet in schools being the kind of answer to the thorny problem of an education system that was still lagging behind. And in the way that Clinton and Gore and other politicians of the 90s of both parties talked about Silicon Valley, talked about the internet, talked about computing generally as this answer to a lot of problems that America was struggling with, as this future tense was something that was, again, repeating back and amplifying the story about an entrepreneurial Silicon Valley that thought different, that did things differently, that perhaps its way of thinking could fix the way the old economy or old politics worked. And then this has really reached a crescendo, perhaps, in the sort of, if we're talking about presidential love affairs with Silicon Valley, when we look at the Obama administration, which from the time Barack Obama was a candidate in 2007, he's coming to Google, having a sit down with Eric Schmidt, subsequently visited Google and Facebook and others many, many times. I'm sure that many people in this room probably remember seeing an Obama motorcade or two, either coming for an event or a fundraiser or both, during the Obama years. And a lot of people who were at Google and other tech companies, going and working in the Obama White House, and then vice versa. And again, this idea founded in, a kind of really sharing the technological optimism that has fueled Silicon Valley since the very beginning, that a lot of what Silicon Valley's products could be an answer to political problems, social problems, that the answer to fixing the way that, problems that weren't solved was perhaps there was an app for that. And so that this emphasis on sort of technological centrality of new tools of social media and those new platforms of communication, as well as promoting science and technology generally, were something that was an important hallmark of the Obama administration. And so, and this is for anyone who's actually a quant in this room, this is my very, very rough and ready OCR word search, and I'm sorry I don't have the Obama administration on there too. But with this becomes a sort of escalation in political rhetoric about entrepreneurship more generally. And oftentimes when presidents are talking about entrepreneurship, they're talking using high-tech entrepreneurs and Valley entrepreneurs as kind of this case in point of this is how it should work. So you go from like the word never really being invoked, and then Jimmy Carter says it a little bit, and then Ronald Reagan just goes to town, a little dip with George H.W. Bush, and then back up with Clinton, and then Bush 2 and Obama, you still have a steady upward swing. This political love affair with the Valley seemed oftentimes a very one-way street. It seemed like presidents were talking, exhorting, exalting the entrepreneurs in garages. Meanwhile, a figure like Steve Jobs admitted to a reporter in 1984 without a speck of embarrassment that he had never voted in his life. He just didn't see the point. I think subsequently he voted, I hope. But nonetheless, this disassociation from politics that particularly technologists of kind of the post-1980 generation had, and their professed kind of distaste for Washington, its bureaucratic, all its bureaucratic requirements, and really a very deeply felt feeling that Silicon Valley has succeeded despite government, not because of it. That the only reason that Silicon Valley was able to do what it did was that the government got out of the way. Now that part of the assessment is absolutely correct. The government did get out of the way, but what it did first is it funneled an immense amount of money in this general direction. And that is really the hidden political history of Silicon Valley that helps us understand how we got to now. So the first place we need to start is back in the beginning, or one point in the beginning, not the very, very, very beginning of the Valley's technological history, which was Federal Telegraph and all these extraordinary little companies in the beginning of the 20th century. No, the beginning I want to start with is the beginning of the Cold War and the beginning of the space race. Moments when the federal government upped its spending to an unprecedented degree on science and engineering, on R&D, on defense and non-defense related microelectronics and electronics, on things the Valley made like radar and microwave and microchips. The US government was Silicon Valley's first and greatest venture capitalist. What the Defense Department did and the other big agencies, what NASA did, both before but particularly after 1957, when the launch of Sputnik into space created political panic and sent the missile and space program into overdrive, was to funnel a great deal of money towards companies that made these types of technologies. And where was the center of all the action? It was here. It was just up the road in Sunnyvale. Lockheed Missile and Space Division, headquartered here, the largest employer in Silicon Valley into the 1980s. Well into in the middle of the 1980s, Lockheed had almost 5 times as many employees as Apple did, which is something that is not often, it's easy to forget that this defense economy was very, very long-lived and extremely important as a sort of anchor of the Valley's innovative economy. But it wasn't just big defense contractors, because if that were the story, it would just be, Silicon Valley is just like LA, right? LA was an aerospace hub. Seattle was an aerospace hub. But what made Silicon Valley's, all of these hardware and software companies grow and flourish from generation to generation? Well, it was an offshoot of this. It was the way that this money was spent. So when it came to microelectronics and building small, building little things, this was something that not many companies did, that you needed bleeding edge technology. So let's take, in case in point, the Apollo programs, Apollo rocket space, sending astronauts into space, into the shooting the moon. What do you need to send men up to space, men to the moon? You need fast rockets and light rockets. You need as little weight as possible. You need to miniaturize everything. So you need very, very powerful and very small and light electronics. What's happening almost around the same time is this push. This is just around a little bit before John F. Kennedy is announcing we shall go to the moon by the end of this decade. Robert Noyce is down at Fairchild Semiconductor, is inventing the integrated circuit. Well, he and others are integrating the integrated circuit. And the integrated circuit is this, it's multiple transistors on one chip. It's the beginning of sort of microchip technology. I'm sure there are people in the audience who know a lot, can tell us a lot more about the technological specifications of this. But this was a classic example of a blue sky product for which there was not a market. It was dearly expensive to make, kind of over thousands of dollars to create in the early 60s. But it was exactly the sort of thing that you needed to have a light and fast and powerful rocket that could send men into space, that could send data back down and back up. And so NASA, the space program, became a major customer for these ICs, for these integrated circuits. And in doing so, it was not the sole customer. There were the thing about the companies that the semiconductor companies that grew up here in Silicon Valley, it wasn't like they were all 100% federal business, but in the early days, when they were just startups, they had a big book of federal business, a big book of military business, and space program business, and that helped them get going, and that also drove the price down for these really sophisticated pieces of equipment. And so in driving the price down, then you can start to commercialize, then it can start to go into other types of things. So a company like Intel, which is founded just up the road from here in 1968, here's Andy Grove, for 1 year in. A company like Intel is this sort of interesting hybrid. It's not a defense contractor in the way that Lockheed is, but it also is thriving and growing kind of on this boomlet that's created by all of this military spending. Not to mention, and those contracts were just one dimension of that. The other dimension of that was all of the money that's flowing to colleges and universities, particularly for science and math education. It is enlarging American higher education vastly. I was talking to some students this afternoon and saying, next time you go on a college campus, including this one, look at all the buildings that were built in the 1960s. That's a sign that not only was the campus growing, but science programs were growing. A lot of science buildings kicking around that were built in the 1960s on different college campuses across the country. This is where all of this federal money is landing, the kind of post-Sputnik spend on let's get America's scientific capacity up to the level of the Soviets so they can't beat us to the moon. All of that money is giving college students of the 1960s, of the baby boom generation, this extraordinary access to new resources like computers, computer hands-on experience programming and writing software languages. These, of course, are mainframe computers, and then mini computers. There are no desktops by this point. Still very, very big computing, but only academic labs, only university labs were one of the few places you could find computers. But so many of the 1960s generation, like this guy pictured behind me, Lee Felsenstein, had their first exposure to a computer in a university lab. In his case, it was at Berkeley. But his story is, he is someone who's an important figure in the homebrew computer club of the 1970s, but his story is a sort of generational story that is held in common by a lot of people who later became foundational to the next generation of Silicon Valley. He grows up going to winning middle school science fairs and going to kind of being enraptured by science. And he's, growing up in the age of the space race, dreaming of, dreaming of space, inspired by the astronauts, comes to Berkeley, learns computing, learns programming, has a great aptitude for it. And he also, while at Berkeley, at the very same time, what else is going on at Berkeley and Stanford in the late 60s? The protests against the Vietnam War. So simultaneously, while these people who are being effectively educated and introduced to computing by the military-industrial complex are protesting against the same military-industrial complex and thinking about and becoming entranced by computers and thinking, how can we turn these machines from weapons of war to weapons of social change and peace and communication? Here's Felsenstein. He applied, one of the ways he expressed, tried to meld these two passions while he was a college student was that he helped out the anti-war movement at Berkeley by designing his own bullhorn that they could use to rally the crowd. So he sort of uses his technical talent to sort of make this very powerful portable bullhorn. So there he is holding his bullhorn. And then he later goes on, he works at Ampex, which is another sort of iconic, very early Valley company, now best known for its sign or disappearing sign, but a very important early Valley player. And then ends up as a sort of part of the early 1970s personal computing movement, people's computing movement that's emerging, sort of clustering around Stanford. And by the time you get to the middle part of the 1970s, he's a founding member of the Homebrew Computer Club, the sort of famous gathering from which Apple and other personal computer companies emerged, this sort of coming together of these hobbyists, again, brought together by this computer politics. It's all political. This politics that is very much against the military establishment that helped create the Valley, sort of rethinking how you use computers for good, but also seeing the computers as these tools that, kind of like the politicians I was talking about at the beginning, tools that could fix all of society's problems. If you have a computer, it's going to get sorted. If you connect everyone, it's all going to work out. Rather than grappling with the really difficult questions of structural inequality and social change and fundamental changes in society, the notion, a very optimistic and a very hopeful notion, one that stems from this sort of understanding of how powerful and extraordinary computers could be, is that if everyone has access to a computer, then we will heal the divisions that are separating our society. Then we will have a way to form a new way of living. So the people of Lee Felsenstein's generation weren't just the Lee Felsensteins. In the same place, at the same time, there's also a baby boom era generation that is also talking about changing the world and seeing a very, very different means to that end. And what's so interesting to me is how these two groups are not only generationally the same, but they are occupying almost exactly the same space. Yet there is very little communion with them. And you have to look no further than San Jose State University. Here was the hub of the Black Power movement, the Black Student Union, where you have two of the iconic figures of 1968, the Olympic athletes, who are San Jose State students, who have been, their politics comes from this community that grows up around this university in the late 1960s that is talking about changing the world, but they are talking about, we've got to fight racism, we've got to fight gender discrimination, we've got to fight structural inequality, we've got to fight poverty. And they're not talking about computers at all. And at the very same moment, just a few miles up the road, Intel is being founded. All of these companies that will define Silicon Valley, not just for the next decade, but for decades after, because many of the people in those companies then become venture capitalists and they fund the next generation of companies. It's like they could have been on different planets or different solar systems. It's an extraordinary separation. And I think that those two politics, those two different worldviews about how you change the world, on the one hand, computers are going to fix it. And again, this is an idea, a story that gets a lot of political traction and up until very recently has had immense traction in Washington, D.C., unquestioned. And then on the other hand, one that's a lot thornier to solve, but one that's more realistic. And the first one is the one that shapes Silicon Valley companies going forward, and is how you have this disconnect that we're grappling with right now about how these devices and these platforms that are being created, how they're affecting a broader society and what one does about it. So as we move from the Vietnam era into the 1960s, the other thing that, in sort of thinking about these connections and how these politics are playing out as this industry grows, is to once again connect the ascent of this economy, this industry here, with the disintegration of everything else, the old economy and old politics, old Democrats, old Republicans, old ways of doing things. The 1970s are this watershed moment when the formula that seemed to have worked for a while didn't work anymore. The economy was going sideways, and America was hungry for new faces, for new ideas. And this is also where the California-ness of Silicon Valley and California politics, I think, are an important piece of the story, again, of understanding how we get to now. And no one better epitomizes this than our governor, former and current governor, Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown is elected in 1974. He's this new face, new faces, key races. And Jerry Brown is maybe the first of the new Democrats. He's elected in 1974 he's a Watergate baby, like this whole wave of young Democrats who were elected after the resignation of Richard Nixon. A new wave of young faces in Congress. That's why last night's midterm kind of reminds me a little bit of 1974, where you have a lot of new blood coming in. And Jerry Brown is a new sort of Democrat in that he is also looking to the high-tech industries and technology as this answer for California, and also as a kind of a new way of thinking about a kind of a new philosophy, like how you get out of the old hierarchies, the old way of doing things in the past. Jerry Brown is a staunch ally and a good friend to the high-tech industry. By the early 1980s, he is convened a California Commission on Industrial Competitiveness that is this fascinating cross-section of California economic interests, but also includes a big cohort from the Valley tech and venture capital communities. So for all the Valley rhetoric about we don't do anything with politics, if you look at the paper trail, there's a heck of a lot of hanging out with politicians in the 1980s, and Jerry Brown was one of them. In fact, one member of that California Competitiveness Commission was Steve Jobs, the man who didn't vote. I think he was probably persuaded to do it by his close friend Regis McKenna, who was was a very, very active politically. Regis is a legendary figure in the Valley who was a marketing and public relations head and worked with Intel, and his firm worked with Intel and Apple and many others. But nonetheless, there is this connection at the state level with kind of advancing Silicon Valley, not only its story but also materially. Because one thing that Jerry Brown is interested in is how can the state tax structure and the state encourage the growth of high-tech industry. One of the key things that comes out of the Brown years that actually Steve Jobs had unsuccessfully lobbied for at the national level in Congress was a big tax break for companies that donated computers to schools, which ended up in a lot of Apples ending up in California classrooms in the early 1980s. They were sort of tens of thousands of Apple IIs, subsidized Apple IIs, went into California classrooms. They didn't always come with training. That was a little bit of a problem. But Apple became the brand, became the machine that many, many California middle schoolers and high schoolers, the first machine they encountered. And so Apple knew what it was doing. They were building loyalty early. And so they marketed but they gave computers to K through 12, and they marketed heavily to college students. I had a Mac when I was in college, and boy, I'm still using one now. So clearly this works. But this is, as this new generation grows up, they are one generation removed even now from not only the cold warriors of the first generation of Silicon Valley, the Lockheed generation, the sort of crew-cutted squares in their white shirts and their black ties. They're even younger than the Vietnam generation, the ones who had been in college in the late 1960s, and they are further removed from that political past, that military investment past, and feeling and believing quite strongly that what they are doing is something that is unconnected from and is something they're doing on their own that doesn't have any kind of federal connection to it. And not only do people like Steve Jobs become these new iconic figures of American business, again, kind of plastering the covers of magazines, people that become household names, but also up in Seattle, Bill Gates and the late gone too soon Paul Allen, co-founders of Microsoft, also become these sort of new emblems of where American business is going. And keep in mind, this is all happening in the early 80s. This is a time of recession, a time when Detroit is going to get bailed out by Washington, when these once mighty, incredibly innovative industries are stumbling. And politicians of both parties are looking for the next big thing. And so by the time we get to the early 1990s, you have a politics in which Silicon Valley is still like, we're not political. We don't spend time lobbying, although they did. We don't spend time, hobnobbing with politicians or raising money. There was a real disconnection. And it's true of the younger generation of Valley technologists, there was not a lot of time spent. People weren't going to political fundraisers. First of all, they didn't have enough money at first, and when they did get money, they bought a sports car. They didn't go raise money for a politician. Gary Hart actually attempted, really wooed hard, Silicon Valley hard, when he ran for president in 1984 and briefly in 1987 and 88, but he, really couldn't get the love back. But the person who did get the love back was Bill Clinton, because he's very persuasive. He really, starting in 1991, even before he declared, he was coming out here and having these small meetings with Silicon Valley leaders and talking to them about what they cared about and listening and giving them the full Bill Clinton treatment, which was, he's just this incredible political talent, and was and won people over, including people who were just staunch Republicans, people like John Young, the former CEO of Hewlett Packard, was moved over to be a Clinton supporter. And when he ran at the later stages of the 1992 campaign, this unprecedented thing happens, which is that there's this public event with all of these Silicon Valley CEOs and leaders lining up and endorsing Clinton Gore en masse, this business group that's going against the party of business, the Republican Party, saying George Bush hasn't done anything for us. Bill Clinton's going to do better. So it's this new kind of entry of a coming out party for Silicon Valley leaders and technologists and politics. And then as I said, during the Clinton years, there was a lot of back and forth between the White House and the Valley, something that isn't, again, remembered as well, or something that was sort of trumpeted from the rooftops, but it was a very important connection, because what was happening during the 1990s, the laws that were shaping today's internet economy, today's social media platforms, today's telecom economy, net neutrality, and more and more and more and more, are all being shaped and decided upon in those Clinton years. And so where do the Valley folk come in? They're like, look, don't regulate us. Let us self-regulate. Don't penalize us for speech that may occur on our platform. And in the early days of the internet, of the commercial internet, this seemed like something that was reasonable, that the internet was born as a government project. It had been an academic network for communication. It had the potential to become this extraordinary communications platform, and as Clinton and Gore were swift to repeat again and again, this tool for empowerment, this tool for bringing people together, for getting information to people in these places, particularly young people in places where it was hard to access, that it was going to have this democratizing effect if you DC. And as they've sort of now looking back, quarter century later, they reflect in hindsight, some of them publicly, some of them privately, but I heard again and again from so many people I talked to when I was doing the research for the later stages of this book, which was that we had no idea what we were unleashing. We couldn't believe we believed it would just bring positive effects. We didn't anticipate the other things that might happen. And I think, too, that is also a kind of legacy of history, again, of this disconnect between the role that politics and government action played in the growth of the technology industry, one that certainly kind of could not have happened without entrepreneurial gumption and innovation. But it was a kind of looking away from some of the historical realities that were shaping the industry. So the industry, too, changes, and the people who are the Valley people change over time. But they have a kind of politics that becomes more sort of closely associated in the public imagination with a kind of anti-government, libertarian, let us be free, information wants to be free, and so do we. And the less government, the better. And Washington should just stay out of our business. And this, I think, gets amplification and kind of becomes shorthand for what Silicon Valley politics is in the last decade or so. In a way, because I think in this room, I think if I did a poll of people's politics, I think we would find there was not one Silicon Valley politics. I think if we went into Google or we went into Facebook and asked people about their politics, we would not find one Silicon Valley politics. But yet, to the outside world, a Silicon Valley politics is one that is very is kind of anti-government and more strongly libertarian, pro-free enterprise. And I think part of that got velocity because of people like Peter Thiel. This is the famous picture of which I think most of the participants are very embarrassed of the PayPal mafia, which was taken for Fortune magazine in 2007. And there they are, masters of the universe. But it includes people who have been very outspoken politically, including people like Reid Hoffman, who are very outspoken Democrats and supporters of democratic policies, but also people like Thiel who broke with the Silicon Valley norm in 2016 and endorsed Trump and spoke at the convention. And others, in that crowd who, and this generation too, PayPal mafia is in a way, it's something of become a shorthand for this post-dot-com boom generation of young male entrepreneurs, many of whom who have holding some degree from Stanford, many of whom knew one another in college, many of whom have had outspoken politics and a politics that's sort of distinctly antagonistic towards the old politics of Washington, D.C. and the traditional ways of doing things. And that is kind of fueled, again, kind of layered on top of this story that's been many decades in the making about an entrepreneurial, two guys in a garage Silicon Valley further dissociates the technology industry from its very real history and the many different textures of politics that play out in this valley. And so now we have this really interesting dissonance in some ways in the modern tech industry. I had to put a Seattle slide in here, you guys, because I'm from Seattle. Seattle, which by the way has really, Facebook, Google, you name your big valley company, they have thousands upon thousands of employees in Seattle now. They are a very, very big footprint. But you have companies whose sort of presenting themselves corporately as these don't be evil, in the famous slogan of Google. These companies that are progressive, maybe small p progressive in their politics, that are, kind of projecting tolerance, projecting inclusion, projecting technology as this tool for we are going to fix all of the problems that are fracturing the globe because we're going to have this portal of wonder, this web browser, this tool, this social media platform. Connection is the answer. But in the past, and really has sort of taken off with a remarkable velocity kind of in the time that I've been working on this book. I started working on this book about 5 years ago, and when I would tell people I'm writing about politics and Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley, they would be like, is there a story there? Which that in itself was data point for my research. But now I tell people, and they're like, oh, yeah, there's definitely a story there because we have, Silicon Valley has become the story. And there's much more sort of questioning about where all of this brought us. And part of the challenge is that there's the thinking in Silicon Valley still does see this place as the place of creation, the place that didn't, that actually was the place of invention where it all started, that's missing this longer history, that's missing this backstory. This was a sign that someone pasted on a staircase, a stairwell in the Facebook offices that some enterprising photographer took a picture of that I now get to put in my book. But as any technologist in the room knows, any student of technology knows, Silicon Valley did not quite invent the internet. Just like Al Gore didn't, but it was the core of it was the Defense Department, was DARPA, was why do we have the internet? We have the internet because of the military-industrial complex. We have the internet because of the race to space. We have the internet, why did DARPA comes into being right after Sputnik. Now, this is not to say that everyone in the technology industry is kind of operating without a sense of history. There are many, many keen students of history and people who clearly are making choices in their both business choices and personal choices with that history in mind. And there's some really interesting generational connections between the old Silicon Valley and the new Silicon Valley. Steve Wozniak's father was a Lockheed engineer. That's why he was here in the first place. Kids of Lockheed engineers are the ones who made modern Silicon Valley. It all comes, Lockheed is kind of the mothership. But also, there are people beyond the valley who have this connection to this military-industrial complex. One of the really great stories, examples of this that I love to tell is that of Jeff Bezos' grandfather. His grandfather is someone that he talks about often, who was very important in his life. He spent summers going to his West Texas ranch and kind of learning to brand cattle and fix windmills, and sort of uses it as a case study in self-reliance and how you just have to figure out how to make things work when you don't have any other resources to rely upon. But also his grandfather, Lawrence Preston Guise, was a longtime employee of the federal government. In fact, he was one of the very first employees of DARPA in the first 3 years of its existence. He was its deputy director. He did ballistic missile research. And then he went on to run the western region of the Atomic Energy Commission, which means he was running, kind of supervising the thousands of people working at Los Alamos and at Livermore and at Hanford and the Nevada test site. He knew exactly how the relationship between the federal spending and the buildup of the Cold War defense complex and what it was reaping. In Livermore, they were, building supercomputers. In, you name it, these foundational technologies are coming out of this defense complex. And so, this awareness, this connection, this realization, and I think this also informs when last week or a couple weeks ago, Bezos was on stage talking to Stephen Levy at the Wired conference and reflecting on the really contentious issue of whether big tech should take defense contracts, which has been a really hot issue this year in the Valley and something that employees have gotten very, very concerned about. And he said, I think if tech companies step away from defense work, that's going to be bad for the country. And I just heard his granddad, Pop's Guys, in the backdrop there thinking, and I have no insight into Jeff Bezos' thinking. We're both from Seattle, but that's kind of where it starts and stops. But it was a really interesting, I think, sort of moment of revealing that he does understand this long history, and this is not a new thing. It never went away, and it is something that continues to animate the Valley to this day. So what are the lessons from this venture into Silicon politics and this history? Well, one is that politics matter. I don't think I have to convince many people of that now. That the political story of 2018, of this decade and after, and the story, the business story and the technological story of the Valley are intertwined, and they're not going to get untangled. That there needs to be a real reckoning in the tech industry and also in Washington, D.C. about how these technologies work and where we might go from here to continue to have these world-changing, trillion-dollar companies that are now so critically important to communication and to commerce and to connectivity. But how do we do that without sacrificing the things that we as a nation value? Politics matter because and this is something that employees of these large tech companies that are now very, very large have to reckon with questions of the persistent gender inequalities that that continue in the tech industry and in the Me Too era, but ones that have existed long before that. The way in which women in tech have been marginalized and pushed to one side. I spoke to a women's history class here on campus earlier today and was talking about this sort of moving out of women from the center of the picture, from the software coders and programmers of the World War II and the early Cold War era to being moved further and further away from being considered technically important and significant to the whole enterprise. And to understand that, not just to understand the question of women and the gender disparities in tech, but also the racial disparities and the class disparities, to understand how Silicon politics might go forward. What is the true politics of the technology industry? What informs it? How might the products it makes and the people who are in it think about a more inclusive sort of technology? How can it truly maximize the world-changing potential? And by bringing more people in and also thinking about who the end users are in a more meaningful way, and also thinking about what their products can do. Because Silicon Valley has indeed changed the world. It has done extraordinary things. We are all sitting here with supercomputers in our pockets. That is amazing. So how can we harness this innovative energy and all of the good things that have come out of this industry and this place, of all the amazing people and the amazing technological and non-technological minds that have helped it happen, both the people that have gotten celebrated like Steve Jobs and the people who have been these hidden figures on the side but still have made it run? How do we go from here? I think that's the challenge. I think it's an exciting one. It's a difficult one. But part of that is some of the answer is going to come right here from the Valley itself. It's a time to look inward and to act differently. I'll leave it there. And I think we have time for questions, and Kylie is going to we have a couple of microphones walking around, so if you just raise your hand, she'll come to you.
Hi, thank you for that. Could I hear your thoughts on the James Damore and the Google firing of him and things that have come out of that?
Yeah. That's a really interesting moment, and I think again it's another example of how these companies that kind of started up as they were startups that grew giant and then in many cases kind of keep a startup mentality. So sometimes it's hard to believe, and especially at a place like Google, which has really built itself as a place that is, being googly, that this sort of this community of this extraordinary place to work where people kind of get along and it's a happy place. That's at least the idea. I think that I think that the way in which, because it played out, I'm not at all surprised by the outcome, and in fact, Google's response was a very kind of typical corporate response, and probably the responsible corporate response. What made it more challenging was kind of this iconoclastic, we're different than everyone else image that Google projects, in which it was understood by some as this quashing of free speech. But was it? No, it was actually, there's free speech and then there's speech that was, antagonistic, and particularly in a human resources setting, was not in the way that and using company resources to do it was not. And if he'd been delivering a message that was coming from the other end of the political spectrum, it might have been just as controversial and just as challenging. I think what's really interesting is that there is what it did reveal is there's maybe because the swing towards the left side of the political spectrum, which was not always the case as clearly in the Valley all the time throughout its history, is now become kind of, there's this sort of easy, and maybe I think it's partially a Northern California thing. There's sort of this easy assumption that, well, it's a blue state, everyone's, sort of thinks the way I do, that there can be that those who do feel differently can feel that there's another, that there's something else at work. But I will say materially, his complaints about the kind of people getting special treatment don't actually gel with the reality of when you look at the numbers of how, I think there is probably it's high time for some kind of affirmative action of some kind in tech, because the kind of laissez-faire, let's just pick the best people we can from Stanford and MIT, has kind of perpetuated a kind of closed circle of not really bringing all the best possible voices in the room. And when you're making products that are used by so many people and have such global markets, I think that becomes problematic from a business standpoint as well as a cultural one.
What's your take on machine learning and big data being used to set sentencing guidelines in a black box algorithm where you don't know what the biases of the algorithm are?
Yes. Well, I think that goes to this is why the stakes are so high, why, increasing diversity is not just kind of a nice thing to do and a thing like a sort of nice HR sort of fig leaf, that this actually is fundamental to the technological products we make. And part of the challenge, I think, is that there's been a kind of doctrine of presumed neutrality of the platform, right? That AI is better, doesn't bring in the biases of human biases, so it's better. And this was certainly kind of the philosophy of in a way where the current Valley is the child of literally the child of the academic child of the 1990s era Stanford Computer Science Department, which was very much about a kind of information should be free, Unix-driven, open, that the platform itself should be neutral, should not have an opinion on anything, but it also presumed that it was possible to create a neutral platform or a neutral algorithm. And it believed that the algorithm was sort of the solution to bias, and when you have kind of a rather narrow slice of people who are designing that, as much as they try, they don't intend to, we all bring our biases into anything we're creating, right? Even if you're not meaning to. So I think it's extremely problematic, considering that software is running everything. Like, it has eaten the world. We are eaten by it. So what do we do to make sure that software is and recognize that biases are built into it? I think that's the first step, which is a novel concept for many around here. But it's starting to break through, I hope.
You were talking about women in technology, and I go back to the 1970s and think of several women I worked for, which were great in technology. But do you have a backstory on Sandy Lerner or Sandra Kurtzig or some of those women who were successful?
Yeah.
Were others just not recognized, but were there? Do you have any? Sandy Kurtzig, I knew her before she got started here.
Yeah.
So do you have some backstories on them and what they did and how they succeeded?
Yeah. Sandy Kurtzig is a great story, and this is an opportunity for me to plug another great book about Silicon Valley by someone else, Leslie Berlin's Troublemakers. Leslie's book is fantastic. She's a biographer, wrote a terrific biography of Bob Noyce about a decade ago, and just last year came out with Troublemakers. I highly recommend it for anyone who's a Silicon Valley history fan. And you have a good, 11 months or 8 months to read it before you buy my book in July. But she really goes deep into Sandy's story, and that's a sort of fascinating. I think in both cases where you have these successful female entrepreneurs who build these companies, they come from, Kurtzig is very interesting. She's sort of an autodidact. She kind of learns, she doesn't have a fancy MIT engineering degree. She kind of figures out how to program, and she's also a very she exhibits the toughness and the fierceness, and what you had to do to get ahead in this extremely male, particularly kind of macho sort of semiconductor industry era Silicon Valley, was you had to not just be one of the boys, but be as hard driving as and kind of prove yourself. But she was a great example of someone who had a good product. She worked extremely hard to sell it, to build this company. Her company goes public. She's sort of this extraordinary figure. And I think they are the exceptions to the rule, because there are always exceptions to the rule. One of the things with the technical women, I didn't talk to her for my book, but I talked to other women who were technical women in Silicon Valley during that period. And one of the things that they said was a challenge too was that so many, the somewhat traditional, in the companies in which they worked, there was still sort of this traditional male breadwinner, wife at home. I mean, part of the secret of Silicon Valley, it's certainly early Silicon Valley in the sort of 50s, 60s, early 70s, were these women who were kind of keeping the house going, keeping everything running while these guys were going and working 18 hours a day. So, I mean, there were lots of women in Silicon Valley, and they were contributing to the success of these companies because they were kind of keeping everything else going. But I think the women that I talked to were sort of talk about, yes, incidents of discrimination, but they also, they were so passionate about the technology they were building that they kind of were like, this is worth it. But it also was, I think, rather lonely. I think that when you were particularly those that had children, had young children, there was no sort of family-friendly give on. It was sort of an expectation that you do what everyone else is doing. So they kind of just did what they needed to do and saw their children when they could, but felt like there was a whole kind of social worlds that they were excluded from. They were never truly one of the guys, and they were never, because it was such an overly male world. I mean, think about 1960s engineering. Like women couldn't get into a lot of engineering programs, not even any science programs. Women who wanted to come and major in chemistry, like, no, sorry, we don't admit women. In a pre equal employment opportunity or civil rights era, you simply did not have. You could be turned away from certain jobs and certain fields because of your gender, and so you have these industries growing out of this field that was, and then it was either they were engineers or they were MBAs, and MBA programs for a long time didn't accept women. So you have these companies growing up that simply just didn't have women in them. And part of the kind of the go juice of Silicon Valley is actually part of one of its greatest assets is the sort of tight network, the network between people who worked together in a certain company and then went and became venture capitalists and funded the next generation and kind of had these close personal relationships. That's absolutely a critical part of this story. But the other, of course, this has a downside, because if you're always going with people you're never looking at the people who you don't know that might be equally as good. And it's a conundrum. It's not easily solvable. If I had the answers, I would be proclaiming them to you from the stage, but I don't. It's just, I think we need to identify this problem and how it evolved.
So in light of the most recent election, do you believe that high-tech companies such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter are not only influencing voters to go out to the elections and vote, but also pushing their own agendas on those individual voters?
I feel like the companies, if anything, are erring in the opposite direction, which is not going so far to not seem like they're pushing an individual agenda, and then kind of letting too many voices, including voices that are incendiary or perhaps not authentic, onto the platform. And this is really Facebook's dilemma, a kind of not wanting to restrict the flow of communication. I mean, communication and connectivity is what built the company. It's foundational to the way they, and also having this kind of open flow is also part of their business model. Like, it's not, this goes against the way that they work, and to sort of censor some would be to censor more. And so, but in this environment where these platforms are such, sort of Facebook and Twitter in particular, are such critical political actors, whether they like it or not, the kind of profession of being this sort of, we're just the platform, and what happens on it doesn't matter, is becoming a harder and harder thing to do. And they are having to take steps to do something about it, but there's a real reluctance and to insert a voice in it. And I don't know if they have, I mean, if anything, they are overcorrecting for conservative voices because Silicon Valley has this reputation of being so liberal. And I think that the general problem is less, should it be liberal, should it be conservative, should it take a side? But it does need to rethink this kind of notion of that. So the idea of the neutral platform doesn't really hold anymore in considering what's happening on that platform. There needs to be a rethinking of it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I think you have primarily approached Silicon politics within a national frame. And I was just wondering what it would look like in an international frame, because I think there are two, at least, data points that we can consider if you place this in an international frame. Starting at least from the 90s onward, the huge influx of immigrant labor to Silicon Valley. And how much that was a part of the policy and the politics of Washington, D.C., managing the immigrant entry and the exits. So that, for example, I mean, on a very personal level, I can tell you that George W. Bush W., who came to my hometown in India to open a consulate to process those H-4 visas double quick because Silicon Valley needed them. And of course, now that we don't need them anymore, there's a kind of a backlash. Those whole visa programs are being shut down. So that was one observation I had. And the other is the influx of foreign capital. And in fact, today I was reading that Saudi money is what is kind of pouring into the Silicon Valley. And they're the top venture capitalists supporting many of the startups. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on these two fronts, one, the labor and the capital from an international.
Thanks for asking that question. First, on the immigration, Silicon Valley, that is the, fundamental secret to Silicon Valley is this immigration. I have a part in my book where I just devote a whole piece to the signing of the 1965 Immigration Act, which really is this turning point in U.S. immigration policy, and it kind of opens up America's gates to these new populations. The irony of it all is that Lyndon Johnson was kind of, because so many people, particularly Southern segregationists, were worried about people of color coming in to the country. Johnson, as he signs the bill, saying, well, this isn't going to make that big of a difference, but it's kind of this symbolic gesture. It's an important civil rights gesture to not have these quotas, because there was this quota system on who could enter the country before that. Turns out it was the most revolutionary thing, perhaps one of the most important things the Great Society accomplished, was that Immigration Act. And then it's followed sort of particularly, this is a very California story and a very Santa Clara County, San Mateo County story, which is the race of immigration, where you have immigration first from Hong Kong and China in the 70s, and then in the 80s and the 90s, immigration from India, where you have these, during the kind of post-1980 boom, it's sort of from the 1980s to the early 1990s, Annalise Saxenian, who's a professor at Berkeley, did this analysis a while back that sort of fully 1/3 of the companies founded in the Valley were founded by immigrants from India or mainland China, like those two places. And so that doesn't even count the immigrants from elsewhere. So absolutely critically important, and this is why the immigration debate is so critical and central to this question of technological competitiveness. Why is Silicon Valley the #1 tech region in the world? It's not because Americans are better at tech than everyone else. It's because we open the doors to foreign students and to technologists and engineers who are coming in from elsewhere. That is why. Free movement of people and capital. That is why. And so on the second, sort of to the free movement of capital, that's a really interesting phenomenon, which is something that it did not the last sort of time that this was a remarked upon phenomenon, or maybe the first time was in the 1970s with Japanese capital, because the venture market, the domestic venture market, was drying up because the U.S. economy, Wall Street was pretty sour, and so companies here were licensing to Japanese companies. This was something that the semiconductor industry lived to regret, because then Japanese chip makers started making better versions and cheaper versions of their products, but also kind of relying on foreign capital for that sort of influx. And now you have all of this sort of these sovereign wealth funds, this overseas capital, a lot of Russian money has come in, as well as Saudi money, a lot of money from overseas, and so that is. I don't quite know what I think further ensnares Silicon Valley and politics, and you saw this most recently in the last month with Saudi Arabia, that all of a sudden, like, wait a minute, look where the Saudi money is. It's fueling all these Valley companies. What are you going to do about it? What's your position? Are you going to turn it back? Most of these companies are not in position to put that money back. I mean, they've gotten so much money from them. But this is another way in which they have to reckon with politics globally, and it also is, thinking about immigration and the larger trajectory. Again, kind of bringing people in as students, and there's been a chilling effect for foreign students wanting to have coming over, chilling effect on people wanting to come here from elsewhere. And now, unlike other eras, you have other economies, in South and East Asia in particular, that have tech economies that have matured, that already have their own startup kind of clusters. They are positioned, and sort of from an academic and an entrepreneurial side, to really do even more to give the United States tech centers a run for their money. And so that's it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward.
So one issue that I think became evident from Facebook's Cambridge Analytica incident recently is that a lot of the self-policing that a lot of these technological companies partake in regarding data use is not going to be feasible, moving forward. And I think it's inevitable that a lot of these countries will enact in something similar to the EU's GDPR.
Yeah.
So the another issue that I also saw was that during Mark Zuckerberg's Cambridge Analytica hearing, a lot of the people responsible for this legislation that is probably going to come out soon don't share the common understanding and just comprehensive scope of what the technology is being used for. Because a lot of the questions there were very rudimentary, and it just seemed like it was like an elementary schooler really asking the questions. So how do you predict and see comprehensive laws around technology being enacted when the people responsible for them don't have that core understanding?
I know, God help us. This is not a new thing. The sort of persistent technological ignorance of senators and congressmen is kind of something to behold. Yeah, how does Facebook make its money? Okay, so we sell ads. We sell ads, Mr. Senator. I think this is again, this isn't just a moment where Silicon Valley, and particularly its biggest tech companies, need to sort of take stock of where they are, but also where Washington decision makers and policymakers have to rethink that tech policy and technology policy, telecom policy has kind of been, a specialist vertical, right? It's been certain people who've been really engaged in it, have kind of chaired the key committees, whose staff really know it up and down and sideways, and then there's a vast sort of sea of others who just don't really know how it works. Regulation is a really interesting question. Will regulation happen? This is a so lightly, it's barely regulated at all. It's sort of the most, we have not had an industry, a large industry this unregulated since the days of the robber barons. We have not. And so I guess part of when I sort of been thinking about this question, I do go back to, what happened after the days of the robber barons. You had regulation, you had measures towards regulation. Now, did they end the days of monopoly? No, they regulated the monopoly. Did you have the trusts busted? No, you had very, very large entities that were operating in a regulated manner. What's happened in the past when there's been sort of similar moves towards, and in the past in antitrust, you had sort of two famous cases. Well, actually, let's call them three. One that worked and two that didn't. The two that didn't, one was IBM, 1969 to 1982, a 13-year-long federal antitrust suit that was started when IBM was basically the entire computer market, and is abandoned by the early 80s in part because the Reagan administration didn't believe in was not into that sort of antitrust enforcement, but also because IBM was no longer the entire computer market. It had diversified, the technology had moved on. Not everything was a mainframe anymore. The other case that didn't work was Microsoft, right? This is the antitrust trial that happens in the late 1990s. Its impetus is very much driven by a lot of people in the Valley who were, particularly Netscape, getting completely squashed by Microsoft's Internet Explorer browser, who kind of urged the Clinton DOJ to look into it and take action, and they did, and it initially kind of came down with a verdict that the company needed to break up, and then the judge in question was all thrown out because the judge had talked to reporters, and it was all, and at the end of the day, Microsoft had, was hobbled, but not, the technology again had moved on, but there was the successful breakup. It's AT&T, a breakup of a large company, but one that had been a regulated monopoly for over a century. I can't, it's dangerous to be a crystal ball gazer. I'm not. I look backwards, not forwards. I know from studying history that those who gaze into crystal balls and make bold predictions are usually wrong. But I don't see regulation happening soon. I also don't, as much as I would like it, I don't see widespread technological literacy happening very soon. I hope it will gradually creep upon them, just as American politicians got cognizant about how to grapple with the new industries of the old economy, like railroads and steel and oil. But there's clearly the current status quo is not going to be sustainable. And the way that we talk about, the way that antitrust laws work and the way that sort of regulations have been structured was with this idea of monopolies are bad because consumers pay more. And anyone who's bought something on Amazon Prime, yes, I bought something this morning because I was too lazy to, it was too easy to do, will know that that is the consumer price issue is no longer a rationale for monopoly. You cannot, that argument doesn't hold when you look at a company like Amazon.
Question?
Do you think that companies such as Apple and Google are putting on this face of social activism to appeal to younger people because that's their main, customer? Or do you think that there's a new demographic or generation of employees that is like truly changing the culture in the company?
I think that those companies, since their inception, have kind of presented let's call it, for lack of a better term, a countercultural face, or sort of this, don't be evil, we're different, we're a different sort of company, we're more humane, we're better, we're a great place to work, we're changing the world, we're sort of positive force. Those words have not always matched the lived experience, not only of the impact of their products, but I think the lived experience inside those companies that have been, it's been really, you have to work really hard, you do a lot. And now what's so interesting is, one of the other hallmark of Silicon politics since the very beginning has been that it's been very, very strongly anti-union and kind of and it's a short, not just unions themselves, but kind of employees mobilization, collectively mobilizing against their employer. This sort of adversarial employee-employer relationship was something that the earliest Valley technologists, and I think Hewlett and Packard really set the tone for the whole thing. They're like, we don't want to Fortune, the way the Fortune 500 does it. We want a more non-hierarchical, more egalitarian way of doing things where if you do good work, you get promoted, and it's management by walking around. We just, you don't have corner offices. And that's in the DNA of every successive company. And so but now these companies are so large and so powerful that the employees themselves are calling them out on, look, you say one thing, but the reality is different, and and I think this moment of employee mobilization and activism, that in some cases, some are calling for some kind of unionization. That has always been historically inside of tech and out. White-collar unionization generally doesn't work in the private sector, historically. But this collective consciousness of kind of taking to heart the messages that they've been told and saying, no, let's actually act to make this a better place. And that's a really powerful and really interesting movement and moment, and I'm interested to see where it goes. Yeah.
I want to thank Professor O'Mara for a great talk. I want to thank this audience for having such great questions, and I think it's really exciting to see our community and our campus come together around really important questions. So a round of applause for Professor O'Mara. And I know that some of you had some questions, so please join us down in the lobby where you can look at copies of Professor O'Mara's 2 books, and she'd be happy to sign them for you as well. And if you are interested in programming at the Hammer, we have sheets where you can sign up to receive our brochure as well as reminders about upcoming events. So thank you so much for coming, and have a good evening.